I'm Carrie Avery Moriarty. That's my author name. This is Trinity January that we're reading from today. So if I stop to talk, I'm going to push these up because I do. So with Trinity, we were given a prompt at the beginning of the month and we had a month to write it. And so I'll read the prompt first and then I'll read my story. So the prompt was, the night was bleak and biting, like only the middle of winter can be, and the sky, cluttered with stars, was wide and cloudless. It was as if the moment was frozen, preserved for posterity by some unseen and all-powerful force that knew what was to come. So, my story is called Royals. On this one, it's on page 113. So it's called Royals. It's freezing, Tristan said. It's always freezing, Erwin replied. Why do we have to be out here? No one will attack us in this weather. The Queen has deemed us worthy of defending her land, Erwin said, as if it were a privilege. Do you not consider it a privilege to guard her? Erwin looked at his partner, then around and whispered, Nothing to do with the Queen is honorable. She is not as powerful as some say. Tristan was shocked. He'd known Erwin for only the few weeks he'd been with them, but he'd not heard him dissent since his arrival. The fact that he spoke it aloud was even more surprising. Shh, he admonished. She isn't around, Erwin said. But the walls can hear you, Tristan responded. Erwin simply rolled his eyes, turning once again to look at the great forest beyond the castle walls. No, he thought. She isn't nearly as powerful as she would like people to believe. No, no, no! The Queen shouted. Jocelyn ducked as the Queen threw a cup across the room. Can't anyone do this right? The dressmaker cringed, and the chambermaid standing on the pedestal shivered. Let's go back. No, 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 the Queen shouted. Jocelyn ducked as the Queen threw a cup across the room. Can't anyone do this right? The dressmaker cringed, and the chambermaid standing on the pedestal, serving as the model, trembled in fear. Everyone knew the wrath of Queen Cecily could be felt as much as heard. Daughter of Tanis, the king of the Northlands, and his consort divinity, goddess of the future, she wielded her power boldly, bowing down to no one. Rumored to have killed the king, killed her father for the throne, she was feared by all who fell under her rule. Over the years, she gobbled up land from lesser kings, adding to her power and wealth. None dared to stand against her. Perhaps a break is in order, Jocelyn said. Give the courtier time to create something more appropriate for the occasion. Yes, the Queen said. Fine, fine, whatever will get these imbeciles out of my presence. Both the maid and the courtier nodded their thanks to Jocelyn as they hastily made their escape. Why do I allow them to remain? The Queen pondered. It is clear they are far beneath what is fitting my status. Because he created the purple gown, Jocelyn said. Surely you remember it. Of course I remember, the Queen sighed, leaning back on the cushions where she lounged. But surely there are others more capable. It seems Iwan has fallen behind on what is required for my court. I think he simply feels like whatever he does will not stack up to the original masterpiece, Jocelyn replied. Nothing will, the Queen said, sipping from another goblet. And that is why his creations are lacking inspiration, Jocelyn said. He knows he can never live up to the first one, never recreate something as magnificent as that one piece was. Your desire for perfection has put the fear of the gods in him. How can he ever hope to please your high standards? The Queen glared at Jocelyn. True, she was her sister, but that is where the similarities ended. Cecily boasted light hair, pale skin, and crystalline eyes. Jocelyn was a near-perfect opposite, with her black hair, deep, rich skin, and night-dark eyes. Both had the height of their father and the slender build of their mother, but only Jocelyn kept the king's dark coloring. The other thing Jocelyn had that Cecily lacked was patience and an even temper. Where Cecily exploded, Jocelyn soothed. Jocelyn was friendly to everyone who she crossed paths with. Whether they were highborn or a lowly stable boy, she greeted each with a smile and a kind word, something Cecily never understood. "I'll call for a meal," Jocelyn said as she walked to the door. "Perhaps that will help with your mood." "Make sure they bring something sweet," the Queen insisted. I'm going to have to take a drink real quick. "Welcome back to the warmth," Treherne said. "I'm glad to be out of the frost," Tristan replied. Erwin simply made his way to the stone hearth to warm himself. While he enjoyed the camaraderie of his fellow warriors, he relished his time alone. Since he'd arrived, there'd been little need for the combat that they were all trained for, so Erwin simply spent his spare time reading. The others joked with him about it, but he knew that many secretly wished they had been taught. He'd contemplated helping some out with it, but knew none would ask. It wasn't the warrior way to be knowledgeable in those sorts of things. "What have you got there?" Tristan asked when he'd made his way to the fire. "Some sort of frivolous musing?" "Something like that," Erwin said. "I honestly don't understand why you bother with those things," Tristan said as he sat next to his friend. "They'll get you nowhere in life." Erwin simply nodded, paying no mind to what his friend said. He knew more than most of the guard how important the history of the land was to his task. "Iowan?" Jocelyn asked as she came into the room. "Princess," he replied sweetly, "I wanted to thank you for assisting me in getting out of that situation." "It was my pleasure," she replied. "How is Maribeth?" "Shaken," Iowan replied. "She's not seen the Queen in this kind of a mood before." "You seem to be handling it well," Jocelyn said. "She can't ruffle my feathers that easily," he replied. "Did you find what she was looking for in her dress? I am happy to recreate the purple gown, but I know she doesn't want to have the exact same thing this time." "You are right," she said. "I think if you find something similar with enough variance, you should be fine. What did you have in mind?" "Come look at what I've drawn," he said as he made his way to a table near the window. "I was thinking of something like this." Jocelyn looked down at the parchment with a sketch of what he had in mind and marveled at his talent. Not only could he create flowing beauty in fabric, but he had captured its likeness on the sheet. "I cannot imagine her not loving this," she said in awe. "What colors were you thinking?" Her fondness for purple makes me hesitate," he said, moving to a counter across the room. "This, however, just came in from the Southlands, and I thought it might work well." He picked up a bolt of fabric that shimmered in the lamplight in hues of blue. "It's magnificent," Jocelyn exclaimed. "I think she will really enjoy the way it sparkles." "I'd thought to add some jewels to the bodice for additional shine," he said, clearly pleased with her reaction. "You know her very well," she said, smiling. "You would look radiant in this fabric as well," he said. "But my sister won't want to share it," was her reply. "I thank you, though, for the compliment." "She has never liked sharing the spotlight," he replied. "Even when she was a tiny tot, she always wanted to be the center of everything." "That desire hasn't faded either," Jocelyn laughed. "I should let you get back to your duties." "A visit with you is always welcome," Ione replied. "I'll have something to show Her Majesty by the end of tomorrow." "I'll let her know," she said as she exited. Making her way through the castle, she found herself in the bastion of the rear wall. When her father was alive, he would often be found in this same place, discussing strategy and warfare with the men of his guard. While she didn't intend to discuss such things, she did enjoy time spent with the men who worked hard to protect the people of the city. "Your Grace," Traherne said, bowing low. Traherne was head of the guard and known to her well. The other men in the room were quickly up and bowing upon hearing his proclamation. "Stand up, you fool," Jocelyn admonished. "I am not my sister. There is no need to placate with such revelry." "Not placating in your case," one of the men said. Built sturdy, with long legs and broad shoulders, the man commanded attention, and had he not spoken, Jocelyn would have noticed him anyway. "I don't recognize you, sir," she said, hoping he would give her his name. "And you shouldn't," he replied. "Meaning?" she inquired. "Twofold," he said. "I am new to the guard, just in the last month. And if you notice your guard, you are not being protected as well as you should," he said. "You'll have to forgive Erwin," Traherne said, glaring at the man. "He's new to the work of soldier." "Only to your guard," Erwin replied, keeping his eyes locked on Jocelyn. "Have you come to find our weakness?" Jocelyn asked. Tilting his head, Erwin asked, "Do you have one?" "Every army has its weakness," Jocelyn replied. "Have you discovered ours?" "We are the finest army in all the land," Traherne boasted. "That we are," Jocelyn admitted, without taking her eyes off the newcomer. "But we still have areas that we could use improvement. Erwin nodded, a smirk gracing his lips. "So," Jocelyn continued, "what say you? Have you found weakness within our guard?" "Should that not be reported to the head of the guard rather than those of the royal family?" Erwin asked. "Usually, yes," Jocelyn admitted. "However, I would not be the one to tell. That luxury would fall to my sister, and she rarely listens to such trivial things." "Even when they could mean her safety were in danger?" "If what you found puts her safety in danger," Jocelyn said, "then it should already be known to both Traherne and my sister, as well as me. Since I know nothing of the sort, and it appears the head of the guard is in the dark, you must not have found anything so urgent as to demand a report." Bowing his head, Erwin said, Nothing of grave need has arisen as of yet. I have seen things, however, that could do with some improvement." Traherne began to bolster, but Jocelyn cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Please," she said, "won't you accompany me to a drawing room to discuss this further?" Nodding his head, Erwin made to follow the princess. He didn't miss the expression on the face of the head of the guard and knew he'd have to deal with the repercussions later. Jocelyn led the way inside the castle walls proper, moving with ease down the corridors until she came to a small room. She stepped inside, finally coming to stand in front of a large hearth on the wall. The fire inside was small, yet seemed to put out enough heat for the room to not be frigid. Following her lead, he stood next to the burning wood and waited for her to ask her questions. "How long have you been here?" It was not the question he expected, but answered without reservation. 6 weeks tomorrow." "And in that time, you have not once been assigned to a post within?" It wasn't a question, so Erwin held his tongue. "Is this why I have not sensed you?" she asked, looking him in the eye. He smiled, a small thing, then answered, "My guess is that my shielding is much stronger than you have experienced, Your Grace." "Stop with that," she said, brushing the words away with a hand. "Have you come to seek your place as the rightful heir to this land?" "You're good," he said, relaxing. "Was it mere chance that you were in the guardhouse today? Or were you drawn because I was there?" Jocelyn folded her arms across her chest and took in the man who stood before her. True, she hadn't intended to seek out the guard, but whether she was drawn there by him or simple boredom was unknown to her. She didn't want to think she was drawn, as that would mean this man held more power over her than was acceptable. It also might mean that he was more dangerous as well. I often wander the castle, she conceded. It's a large place, and my sister is sometimes difficult to be around. So I've heard, he said, that smile still playing on his lips. Are you here to remove Cecily from the throne? The question wasn't expected, but Erwin wasn't sure how to answer it. Instead, he asked, does she need replacing? Huh, was all Jocelyn could manage in response. While her sister was good in many ways, her demanding nature and need for power could, and likely would, put all of them in danger at some point. That's not a no, Erwin said, but I assume that if you were to say so, it may cause you some danger. My sister's reputation has preceded her, Jocelyn smirked. Have no fear, he said. I have not come for the throne. My task is much more important. Did you see the dressmaker? The Queen asked as Jocelyn returned later that afternoon. He is working on something that should be more to your liking, she replied. I believe he should have something to you in the next day or two. Good, the Queen replied. I would hate to have to replace him. Now, Cess, Jocelyn said, you know full well you would never replace Iwan. He is too valuable. But sometimes he needs to know that I could, the Queen said. What else have you been doing today? Jocelyn thought about her encounter with the soldier, but decided against telling her sister. Just wandering the castle. Thought I might find a book to read in the library. You and your books, Cecily said. Always wandering off in your mind. I just don't understand that. You like your real world, and I like my fantasy, Jocelyn replied. Tell me about the guard, the Queen said. It took Jocelyn a moment to realize what her sister had said. When it registered, she realized that she had been thinking about the man she spoke with earlier. Hoping to keep that meaning a secret, she said the book I found was about a princess who hoped to overthrow her parents, take over the land for herself. So it was a book about me, the Queen said. That it was, Jocelyn said. Nothing did better to distract her sister than to talk about how great she was. The discussion lasted most of the afternoon, Jocelyn recounting things that happened in their past as parts of the fictitious book she had read. By the time the evening meal was called, she was exhausted. How long until the ball? Cecily asked. Just over a week, Jocelyn replied. And is everything ready? The Queen asked. The dishes are planned, the decorations are being readied, the invitations have been sent. Everything is on track, Jocelyn said. The winter ball will be the grandest one you've hosted. Good, the Queen said. We must remind everyone who is the most powerful in all the land. I am sure everyone is well aware of that, Jocelyn said. Joss, the Queen said, what princes have been invited? We can check the list in the morning, she replied. Tonight, I need sleep. Maybe we can find someone suitable to be my consort, the Queen said. Do you think there is anyone worthy of my affection? I'm not sure there is a man alive who could handle your power, Jocelyn said. They will be lucky to be chosen, though. I believe it is time I start thinking about having a child, the Queen said. Wouldn't it be grand to have a baby in the castle? Are you prepared to go through the pregnancy? Oh, the Queen said, I can handle anything. I am the Queen after all. Nothing is too difficult for me. Well then, Jocelyn said, we should begin looking for the proper father for your baby. Yes, the Queen answered, that would be grand. You made quite the impression on the princess, Traherne said. How's that? Erwin asked. She's asked that you accompany her to the ball, the head of the guard said. Such an honor has never been bestowed upon one of the guard. Erwin couldn't tell whether Traherne was pleased or annoyed with the request. I shall endeavor to behave in a manner that would bring honor to you, he said. First, Traherne said, you must go see the courtier. He will create something appropriate for you to wear for the occasion. Once my duties are complete, Erwin began, I shall seek him out. You will go now, the head of the guard insisted. Tristan has taken over your duties for the day. When the royal family requests something, we fulfill their request immediately." "As you wish," Erwin said, and took his leave. Everyone in the castle was busily preparing for the ball. With just 3 days left until the grand event, the guard was no different, ensuring their uniforms were in pristine order, their armor polished to a high reflective shine. As he made his way through the halls of the castle, he listened with more than his ears to the essence of the building. While he couldn't detect anything specific from either the queen or the princess, those around them told him all he needed to know. Those in the kitchen were worried they wouldn't have enough ingredients for the inundation of hungry men and women set to come. Maids were hustling around, cleaning everything from chandeliers to chamber pots, ensuring nothing would look less than perfect when guests began to arrive. Finally, he arrived at the courtier's chambers and was greeted by a young woman. "This way," she said. He followed her deeper into the room until she came to a stop. Erwin looked around at the grand gowns hanging on nearly every empty space available on the walls. When his eyes landed on the man in charge, he noticed he was being measured up. "The guardsman, I presume," the man said. "As requested," Erwin answered. Good, the courtier said to himself after his perusal of the man. "This way." Following along, Erwin found himself in another room, this one full of mirrors and bolts of material as far as he could see. "If you please," the dressmaker said, indicating a stand in the middle of the room. Unsure what he meant, Erwin simply stared. "Up?" "Oh," Erwin said, clearly understanding that he should stand atop the box. "Right then," the dressmaker began, "let's see what we have." For the next hour, the man fussed over Erwin, measuring things, holding swatches of fabric against his face, then discarding them. On it went until finally there was a breakthrough. "Perfect," the dressmaker said. "Then we're done?" Erwin asked. "Not hardly," the courtier replied. "That was for the color. Now, to sketch the suit." With that, he sat down at a desk and began to sketch on some parchment, shading and drawing, then crumpling the paper and tossing it into the fire. On it went for another good hour before he held up a sheet, eyed it against Erwin, who remained on the pedestal, and exclaimed, "Magnificent!" Erwin wasn't sure whether this meant he was finished or if the ordeal had a long way to go. He hoped it meant he was free to leave and return to the men of the guard, although he was likely to receive some grief from them. "Off with you," the dressmaker said, making a shooing motion with his hand. "I'll call you back when I'm ready for the fitting." Stepping from the platform, Erwin picked up his sword from where he'd lain it and exited the room. He quickly made his way back to the bastion and was not surprised to hear the jokes aimed his way. "Where's the new dress, then?" one asked. "Are you allowed back in with us rough gents?" quipped another. "Shall I help you with your sword, son?" joked a third. "That'll do," Traherne said, ushering Erwin into his office. Once there with the door closed behind them, he asked, "What took you so long?" "That man is a perfectionist," Erwin replied. "Most of the time was spent finding the right fabric for the garments. Then it was to sketching, which he said I had to remain for. I was afraid he was going to have me there while he stitched the pieces together." "I was hoping you'd found yourself with the princess," the older man said. "That would have been a much nicer way to spend the day." "Indeed it would," Erwin agreed. "No sight of a single royal the entire time I was in the castle." "No worry," the man said. "I've assigned you as the official guard of the princess for the ball. You are to wear your sword the entire time." "How does the courtier feel about this addition to the wardrobe?" Erwin asked. "He'll have to accept it," the head of guard said. "The royal family's safety is the most important thing. If you must be there, you had better be ready to defend them, whether your sword matches your shoes or not." "Oh, Ion," the queen cooed. "It looks marvelous. You really have done a marvelous job with this outfit." "I I am pleased it meets with your approval, the courtier said, bowing low. This is nearly as perfect as the purple gown, she said. It is beautiful, Jocelyn said. Would you care to see your gown? Iowan asked. Oh, Jocelyn replied, do you have it done yet? It's just finished, he said. Why don't we wait, she replied. I'll come down later this afternoon and see what you've created. Whatever suits you, he replied. When he and the chambermaid left, Jocelyn turned to her sister. Have you looked over the names I gave you? She asked. There are just too many, Cecily replied. How am I supposed to narrow my choices down with just names? I put them in order of most powerful, Jocelyn said. When they arrive, you can decide for yourself which one catches your fancy. Perhaps you will be able to narrow it down if we discuss them. Yes, please, the Queen said with a wry smile. Let's talk about their stunning attributes. I want to make sure my child has not only the most beautiful mother, but a father who is at least passable where looks are concerned. Let's start at the top, Jocelyn said. King Caraccius from the Deep South region is very powerful. With a name like that, the Queen said, he ought to be. What does he look like? And with that, the two women took the measure of each man on the list. They discussed not only their standing within the realm, but also the physical attributes each had. Having had conversations with everyone at the last several balls, Jocelyn was well versed in their knowledge and intellect as well, sharing with the Queen both the benefits and detriments of each suitor on the list. Queen Cecily approved and removed men from the list based on each piece of information Jocelyn provided, and they finally pared the list down to a manageable handful of viable candidates. The test would be, which would the Queen choose as consort? None of them must know they are being considered for this enviable position, the Queen said. Oh, of course not, Jocelyn replied. We don't want to give any of them false hope. I also don't want them trying to persuade me with more than what we have, the elder sister said. There's no telling what these men would do if they knew they may end up in my bed. Isn't that the truth? Jocelyn agreed. Who is going to be your companion at the ball? The Queen asked. Or are you simply going to take one of the men I haven't chosen? I've asked a member of the guard to accompany me, Jocelyn said. A lowly guard, the Queen said. You don't have to deprive yourself on my account. I didn't want to get in the way of any of those you may choose, Jocelyn said. Truth was, she was looking forward to having Erwin with her for this event. The men of the realm tended to get a bit grabby when the wine flowed as freely as it did. Having him there would keep the others in check. Well, the Queen said, if you decide you need a more refined gentleman, please feel free to choose someone from the list, as long as it isn't one I've already picked. I think the guard will be fine, she said. She had peeked in while he was being fitted for his suit and was stunned at the ruggedly handsome figure he made. No, she would not be leaving him for one of the stuffy fools that tried to get on the good side of her sister. They were all false bravado, where Erwin was as real as they came, even if he did hold secrets she couldn't get at. That was the other reason she asked him to accompany her. She hoped to find out what he was hiding. Off to play make-believe then, are we? Tristan asked, simply acquiescing to the wishes of the royal family, Erwin returned, with the fancy duds to boot. Erwin knew that some of the other men were jealous of his ability to mingle with royals. What they didn't know, though, was that he had been mingling with royals his whole life. If the truth about who he was were known by the men of the guard, he would not have been welcomed nearly as easily as he was. It is what is required, Erwin replied. I suggest you be on your best behavior, Tristan said. The Queen may decide she doesn't like you. I would hate to have to remove you from the ball. I'll endeavor to stay in her good graces, Erwin said as he finished fastening his sword. Iowan had balked at the idea of his smooth lines would be ruined by such a monstrosity, but Erwin had assured him that it could not be left out. The statement that it was for the protection of the princess had finally made him see the need. Now, with the sword at his hip and a dagger in each boot, Erwin prepared to meet Princess Jocelyn. "Stay on your toes," Traherne said. "Don't want you forgetting your place." "I will do my best to represent the guard well," Erwin said. "Just don't get in the line of fire when the queen wants something," the older man said quietly. "Thank you for the warning," the younger man replied. "Don't drink too much either," the head of the guard said. "Erwin doesn't drink," Tristan quipped. "I just don't drink to excess," Erwin replied, "unlike some of you fools." The comment was said in jest, and the men laughed at the joke. Erwin could feel their desire to be in his place. Most had known the princess for a while, and all who knew her felt she was much better suited to be head of the family rather than her sister. None, however, would make that statement aloud. "I'm off then," Erwin said as he left the men laughing. Making his way from the bastion, he meandered through the halls toward the main area where the ball was to take place. The princess had asked that he meet her near the ballroom in the library where they first spoke. The closer to the room he got, the more unease he felt. Opening himself up without letting his guard down, he reached out to see where the oddity came from. He knew it would be a short while before most of the guests would arrive, but some were already on the property. He couldn't be sure. There was definitely a foe among those who were there. Slipping into the library, he caught a flash of green. "Hello," he called. Princess Jocelyn turned then, and the sight was nearly more than he could bear. Her dark features set against the deep green of her gown drew him to her. Before he realized it, he was standing next to her. "You look exquisite," he said. "Thank you," she replied, a flush running up her cheeks. "You are not so bad on the eyes yourself." "Only because you cannot see yourself," he said. She cast her eyes down, a move he'd never seen her do before. She was the brave, strong, honest sister. If it had been Cecily, he would have expected the move to be something she used to get attention, or to get what she wanted. Jocelyn wasn't like that, though. She didn't do anything simply for attention, no. This was a true reaction to what he'd said. It almost made him wish he could prevent her grief when his true intentions were revealed. "Will you accompany me to the ball?" he asked formally, putting his arm out for her to grasp. "It would be my pleasure," she replied with a small smile. Walking from the library, they made their way toward the grand ballroom. Erwin could feel the danger the closer he got, but could not quite pinpoint where it was coming from. Jocelyn let out a shudder, and Erwin halted. They were still a few feet from the room, and no one had noticed them. He moved them into an alcove and asked, "Are you all right?" "I'm not sure," she said. "Something feels off." Playing the role of guard, he let his hand fall to the hilt of his sword, moving in front of the princess as to guard her, knowing full well that the danger was not physical. "I'm not fragile, you know," she admonished, pushing him aside. "Never said you were," he replied, keeping her in his shadow. "I simply don't want to hear from Traherne that I failed in my duties." With that, she laughed. It was a light sound bubbling up, bursting forth, breaking the dark spell that had been over them. "It's likely just my sister's mood," she said, encouraging him to return to their walk to the ball. "She'll have my head if I'm late, and she has to entertain the lesser fools." "We wouldn't want you to lose your head now," he said with a smile. "I certainly wouldn't," she laughed. The darkness still hung in the air, but Erwin felt the power from his companion. She could definitely take care of herself should anything arise. Now he just needed to figure out where the threat was coming from and whether he should allow it to do what he was sent to do instead. They are all fools, the queen murmured in her sister's ear. None strike your fancy? Jocelyn asked. King Dougal isn't bad, she said. I just don't know if I can handle the beard. They all have beards, Jocelyn reminded. But it's just so long, Jocelyn offered. Scraggly, the queen said, scrunching her nose up. Perhaps we can convince him to tame it, she said. With the right incentive, men will do most anything. How do you propose we get him to tame his beard without guaranteeing him a spot in my bed? Leave it to me, Jocelyn said. She stood and Erwin stood with her. She wasn't used to having a man be this attentive, and she found she rather liked it. Shall I accompany you, Your Grace? No, Jocelyn said. This is a woman's errand. As you wish, he said, retaking his seat. He watched her walk away from the table and down the steps to speak with one of the maids at the side. I need a favor, Jocelyn said. Anything for you, Ellen said. I'm tasking you with cleaning up King Dougal, the princess said. Beg your pardon? His beard, Jocelyn said. You need to get him to tame that monstrosity and look more presentable. Oh, the maid said. I'm happy to do that. I knew you were the one to ask, Jocelyn said. Erwin watched the exchange, and when the princess returned to his side, he asked, Everything all right? Soon enough, she replied. Erwin simply nodded. He watched the maid make her way around the room, filling wine glasses and fending off several advances by the older men with ease. She found herself next to a fit man, dressed in fine clothes, even if they were bolder than most of the others in the room, save the royal sisters. He watched as the young woman bowed low next to the man, clearly giving him a view down her dress. When he reached up to grasp her arm, she turned and slapped him, the report ringing through the room. He could feel more than hear both the queen and the princess hiding their amusement, and wondered what more was going on. The man stood and brought the girl flush against his body. She pulled back with a strength she shouldn't have and slugged him in the gut. Doubling over and returning to his seat, the man looked up toward the dais, where the queen merely smiled. The young woman leaned over once again, only this time she placed her mouth next to the man's ear. Erwin wasn't sure what she said, but the man looked intrigued. She left the room, and he followed shortly after. That's one way to get what you want, the queen said. She is good, Jocelyn replied. It's not the way I would have handled it, but she has her own resources. While it appeared that Erwin was not listening, Jocelyn knew he heard the conversation. When the man reappeared, Erwin smiled slightly and turned to look at the women. Cecily paid him no mind, focused on the returning man. Jocelyn, however, looked him square in the eye. What do you see? She whispered. He's been cleaned up, Erwin said. Anything else? Has he sobered? And she prodded. Erwin thought a moment, then it dawned on him. He's younger. Very good, Jocelyn said. I wasn't sure you would notice. Most wouldn't, he replied. I, however, am tasked with paying attention to the most minute details. Jocelyn looked at him, taking in his countenance. You don't seem surprised about the change, she said. The queen has high standards, he said. While the man is powerful, he wasn't quite up to what she expected at her side. What makes you think she wants him at her side? Why else would you go to so much trouble? Because he is at the palace, she said. Those who are in our company should be expected to present themselves accordingly. If that were the case, he began, most would be asked to leave or conform. I don't see you making that happen with anyone else. Therefore, I stand by my assumption that she is looking for a suitor to be at her side. Jocelyn looked at the man with new eyes. You are far more than simply a man of the guard." It was a statement, and Erwin felt no need to respond. Instead, he returned to his plate and took a bite. He knew the princess was watching him, looking for a tell that indicated who he was. He also knew that he could not let her know the real reason for his being there. "Are you sure you want to walk with me back to the bastion?" Erwin asked at the end of the evening. "I have some questions for Treherne," Jocelyn replied. "He's expecting me." "Very well," he said. They made their way through the castle in comfortable silence. Erwin had learned a great many things while he sat next to the royal family. Some of it useless, but other bits were far more than he could have hoped to discover by merely being part of the guard. While working with the men who kept the castle safe, he'd found a great many things that would be beneficial when the time came to act on his orders. This, however, allowed him to have the information in a much faster time frame, moving his timeline up greatly. Opening the door to the passage leading to the bastion, Erwin paused as Jocelyn stepped through. They took the few steps in the frigid weather before he opened the door to the building itself. "Your Grace," Treherne said when he saw her. The remainder of the guard who were in the area stood and bowed low. "Please," the princess said, "there is no need for such formality with me. I am not my sister." The men continued to remain low until the head of the guard stood. "As you wish," he said. "What brings you to our door?" "I wish to speak with you," the princess said. "Privately." Erwin took no offense at the words, simply made his way to the bunk where he slept and began removing the fine clothing he'd worn to the ball. He watched as the princess and the head of the guard stepped out the door back into the cold. "I'm rather disappointed in you," Tristan said. "Why's that?" Erwin asked. "It's barely midnight and already you're back in our company," the younger man replied. "Guess you weren't enough man for the princess." "Do you know why she asked to speak with Treherne?" "Likely to tell him not to have you back in the castle," the younger man laughed. "How do you know it isn't to ask that I be assigned permanently to her guard?" Erwin countered. "Not likely," Tristan said. "She has no need for a man to defend her in the castle." "Really?" Erwin said. "And how would you know this? Have you been assigned to her before?" "It is well known that the princess, as well as the queen, have a power they can use to defend themselves," the young man said. "There is no need for a mere mortal to assist them." "I'm far more than a mere mortal," Erwin said. Tristan looked at his friend. He couldn't decide whether the older guard was simply being boastful or if he were more than what he seemed. "You're not as powerful as the queen," Tristan finally decided. "None of that powerful." "Then why does she have a guard at all?" Erwin asked. "She likes to have us around," Tristan said. "It gives the appearance of normalcy." "Not something she would need if she were as powerful as you seem to think," Erwin said. "You're like to get yourself drawn and quartered if you continue with these accusations," Tristan said, just as the guard came back in. "Erwin," he called, "this way." Erwin gathered his sword but left the rest of his garments he'd discarded where they lay. They stepped out the door and he noticed the princess was gone. "The princess asked that I send you to her quarters," Treherne said. "I shall go at once," Erwin replied. "Do not," the older man began, then stopped. Gaining some composure, he continued. "It is absolutely imperative that you not cause the princess any grief. Treat her with the utmost respect and honor. Don't be vile or vulgar in her presence." "Of course," Erwin said. "Did she say what she wanted of me?" Treherne looked the younger man up and down, then said, "If you have to ask, perhaps you aren't as smart as she thinks." "I would hate to assume," Erwin said. "She is the princess after all, and should be treated as such." "And you'll do well to remember that," Treherne said. Erwin stood in the gold, waiting for his superior to give him further instructions, but the man stood there, clearly pondering the ramifications of what was about to happen. "Don't keep her waiting," he finally said when the younger man hadn't moved. Wasting no time, Erwin returned to his bunk and gathered up his tunic, throwing it over his head before heading back out the door. He barely heard Tristan ask where he was going. There was no way he would answer that question. If Traherne wanted the men to know, he would inform them. "Thank you for coming," the princess said as Erwin entered her quarters. "I am sure you have questions as to why I've asked you to come." "When the princess summons," he said, "you answer without questions." "And just because you've come," she said, "it doesn't mean that you don't have some questions." "But it is not for the reason I gave Traherne." "He did not disclose your reasons with me," Erwin said, "simply that I must come." The princess turned and walked to a sitting area within her chambers. Erwin hesitated a moment before he followed. She stood before the fire, looking into the flames before she spoke. "There is a danger coming," she said. "I can feel it." "I will protect you," he said without thinking. "But can you?" she asked as she turned. He felt her gaze, felt the penetration of her thoughts. He yielded to her, allowing her to see within him the true nature of his being there. Her eyes widened when she realized why he was there. "You've come to destroy us," she whispered, "and I've invited you in. How could I be so foolish?" "Princess," Erwin said as he stepped closer, "what do you know of Bonzir?" Jocelyn blinked. She had heard her father speak of the place, but had never been able to get more than the fact that they were allies from him. "Are you from there?" she asked. "More than that," he replied. He moved closer to her, standing right next to her, so she had to crane her neck to see him. "I am the king of Bonzir." "You were allied with my father," she said. "I am allied with your father," Erwin corrected. "My father died a decade ago," the princess said. "Are you sure?" the king asked. She looked at him confused. "I mourned him," she said. "The entire kingdom mourned his loss." "Tell me about his death," he said as he guided her to the settee. "My sister came to me," she began, "told me he'd been killed in a freak hunting accident, that he'd been shot through with an arrow. She was distraught, like I'd never seen her before." "What happened next?" "The men who came back from the hunt were shaken," she continued. "Couldn't believe some of what they were saying. Some stating that a giant beast had slain him, others that it was an errant shot from one of the guard. None of the stories made sense to me at the time. I didn't think anything of it, though, because the medic who had been with them explained that the injury was so gruesome he wouldn't allow either of us to see his body, that he would be buried without a viewing to prevent us from having to suffer the visual of his mangled vessel." "So you never saw him," Erwin said. Jocelyn shook her head, even though it wasn't a question. "Which means you can't be sure that he was actually killed." "Why would they lie to us?" she shouted. "Who would gain from this lie?" "Your sister," Erwin said. "No," Jocelyn retorted. "She adored our father. There is no way she would orchestrate such a fallacy as this." "Not even to gain the throne?" The question hit Jocelyn like a punch. Had her sister taken the throne without their father's death? Did she desire power so much that she would fake his death and send him elsewhere just to have his seat? "Where has he been then?" she asked. "With us," the king said. "Safe and healthy, waiting for the right time to flex his power and regain his kingdom." "But why wait so long?" she asked. "Surely he could have simply come back to the palace and taken his seat, couldn't he?" "Your sister's power is much more than he could overcome on his own," Erwin said. The fact that I was able to come in as a guard without her being aware of my true nature is a testament to the fact that she has let the power that she'd gained go to her head. She thinks that no one would dare threaten her place. She comes to that conclusion through experience, Jocelyn said. Several have tried to stand against her, only to be reduced to nothing. Most would rather give in than to be exterminated. Then why is it that she has never attempted to go against my kingdom? You are an ally, she said. There is nothing to gain by threatening you. Or, she knows that my power is greater than hers, he said. Knows that if she were to attempt to go against me and mine, that we would not only withstand her charge, but push back with such a force that we would be the victor. How do I know that you're telling the truth? Your father told me to tell you that your rabbit's name was Samson. Jocelyn blanched. She hadn't forgotten the sweet gift her father had given her the last time she saw him. While the rabbit was long gone, the memory of him still made her smile. Erwin saw that the statement had done what was intended. Show proof that King Tanis was alive. Take me to him, she said. I'm afraid that I cannot do, Erwin replied. Why not? Your father wanted me to gain access, he explained. Once I was able to determine your sister's power, I was to report back to him. At that time, we will devise a plan of attack. You plan to attack the palace, she asked. Simply find a way to remove your sister, he explained. We are hopeful that none of your countrymen will lose their life. It is the last thing King Tanis wants. How do you plan to remove her from power? Jocelyn asked. She'll not go willingly, and she's not likely to fall for any idle threat. I see you have your father's cunning intellect, he said with a smile. How would you go about removing her from power? The princess asked. Get someone into her bed, he said coldly. King Dougal, Jocelyn seethed. He's your puppet, isn't he? Simply a willing participant, Erwin replied. He was very willing to take on the task of bedding your sister. She is quite lovely, you know. You speak of it as if it is a conquest of battle, she said. Isn't it? You men are all alike, she said as she stood and moved back to the fire. Simply using women to get what you want. Damn the consequences to the woman left in shambles from your little mind war. Are you saying that your sister is weak, he asked? Or were you speaking of your own heart? She turned on him, rage in her eyes. He could feel the power ebbing from her as she attempted to hold it in. My heart is not at stake here, she said. Neither is your sister's, he replied. She is simply attempting to find a solution to her problem, that she is without an heir. She won't take a husband either, as she is not willing to share her throne with anyone. Not even you. You don't know my sister, Jocelyn spat. She is a good person. Erwin laughed at that. Since when has she ever been a good person? Just all you want, Jocelyn said. You don't know her the way I do. Then tell me about her, he said. Tell me why she is fit to sit on the throne, why she should rule this land, why I should willingly let her continue to amass powers and lands. The princess began, then stopped herself. He was right. There was no way she should be leading this country, not just because their father lived, but also because she was not fit. She didn't have the best interests of the people in mind, simply what benefited her most. Pinching the bridge of her nose to alleviate the headache that was coming on, she finally said, You're right. Will you help me? Erwin asked. She hadn't heard him stand, hadn't heard him move, but he was at her side. She looked up into his dark eyes and nodded. What do you mean a holiday? The queen asked. Simply taking in the countryside, Jocelyn replied. She told Erwin she'd helped him. Now she had to leave without her sister knowing the reason. I'll be staying here, the queen said. No need for me to go traipsing through the woods in this weather. I'd rather be in bed with my new consort. I do have an heir to conceive, after all. Jocelyn tried to hold her emotions in check, not give away the fact that King Dougal was not simply to be the consort. The queen misinterpreted her silence, asking, "Do you not find my choice pleasing?" "He would not have been my choice," the princess replied. "No," Cecily said, "you prefer a lowly man to one born of high status." "I simply choose to find a man who is worthy of my time," Jocelyn said. "My choice is not about an alliance, but rather one of the heart." "And would that mean you're taking that guard with you?" "Yes," Jocelyn said. Let her sister believe that she was off on a tryst with the man. Anything to keep her from knowing the real reason behind the trip. "Well," the queen said, "let me know how he is." Jocelyn hugged her sister, then made her way down the steps to the waiting carriage. She turned and waved before climbing in. Erwin was already inside and smiled when she sat across from him. "Not willing to be at my side yet?" he asked. "My sister already has the wrong idea about this trip," she replied. "There's no need to give her more fuel for her imagination." "I'm sure Dougal will keep her mind occupied," he said. "Don't remind me," she said as the carriage jolted forward. The ride through the region was slow going with the snow on the ground. Stopping each night to rest was a necessity, and Jocelyn enjoyed the experience of sleeping in their tents. It reminded her of her childhood. Now, however, she simply wanted the trip to be over and to see her father again. "We're getting close," Erwin said after they'd been traveling nearly a week. "How much farther?" Jocelyn asked. "Just over that rise," he replied. "Should be entering the gates shortly after dark." "Will my father meet us?" "He's been keeping out of sight," the man said. Without knowing who he could trust, he insisted that we keep his true identity a secret. "What has he been doing this whole time?" "Mostly working the land," Erwin said. "He's quite adept at farming. I would never have guessed he were a king had I not known." "As much as my sister loves flowers," Jocelyn said, "she's never taken to the fields. Always demands that they be tended, but never seems to take an interest when the gardeners would discuss their work. And you?" "Like my father," she said, "I love the outdoors. Give me good soil and the right temperature, and I can make nearly anything grow." "Do you come by that from your father?" he asked. "Or does your mother play some part in your abilities?" "The earthwork is my father," she replied, "but the ability to keep things alive when they shouldn't comes from the gifts my mother passed down." "I see," he replied. "Your father is remarkable when it comes to his garden. Not only does he grow the foods we're used to, but he's been immensely helpful when it came time to decide what else we should grow. His ideas about grafting fruits together has been a big boon to our agriculture. The last couple of years, he's increased our yield of crops to nearly double what they were before." They continued to discuss farming and the role it played on their kingdoms. Jocelyn was remarkably well versed in the reasoning behind having a strong community of farmers. Their role in the kingdom was much greater than most realized, and Erwin was pleased that she was well aware of the value it held. She would make a good ruler if her sister could ever be unseated. As anticipated, the carriage rolled under the arch to the palace of Bonzer just after nightfall. Jocelyn was anxious to see her father, but Erwin had told her it would have to wait until morning. He didn't want anyone knowing he'd brought her in either, so they opted to make the entrance less than royal. No one, save a few close confidants, were aware that he had left the kingdom at all. Most believed he was on his annual retreat, studying with the monks in the mountains. Had they known their king was putting himself in harm's way for another royal, they would have been more than upset. His people loved him, which was why he felt the need to help King Tanis. Seeing firsthand the way Queen Cecily treated her subjects was an eye-opener. While his subjects felt they could call on him for their needs, the countrymen of the Northlands were fearful of their leader, often going without necessities in order to keep from disturbing her. The princess, on the other hand, was loved beyond measure. More than once he heard the men of the guard praise the younger sister, talking about her kindness and genuine interest when she spoke to one of them. How she took an interest in their lives, their families, and what was going on with them. She was the reason many continued to be steadfast to the crown. If it were left to Cecily, many would abandon their post and flee the kingdom. "Welcome back," the head of the guards said. "Things went well, I presume?" "Better than expected," Erwin replied as he stepped from the carriage. Turning, he held a hand out and assisted Jocelyn from the coach. "I'd like to introduce you to Princess Jocelyn, younger sister to Queen Cecily." Bowing low, the guard said, "Your Grace." "Please stand," she said. "I don't need such more formalities. It's a pleasure to meet you." Standing but giving a bow of his head, the guard said, "As it is to meet you." "Please have someone make up one of the guest quarters for the princess," Erwin said as they made their way into the castle. "Something close to mine, if that's all right." "Preferable," Jocelyn replied. "I don't need much, just a place to rest for the night. Tomorrow will be busy, I'm sure." "I'll have the cook bring up some supper for you both," the man said. "Thank you, Stefan," Erwin replied. They made their way through the back halls of the castle, climbing stairs to the 3rd floor. When Erwin opened a door to a library, Jocelyn passed him and entered. She looked around and noted that the room boasted a large fireplace, comfortable chairs, and a chaise where one could lounge. All in all, the perfect room, in her opinion. "Please," Erwin said, as he indicated the settee next to the fireplace. "I'll get a fire going to warm us up." "Do you mind?" Jocelyn asked, indicating the shelves full of books. "Be my guest," he replied, then turned back to the task. Jocelyn perused the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines of the leather-bound tomes. Some were large, others tiny, each holding universes within. She came to one that was rather worn and pulled it free. "Bonjour," she read. "It's full of our history," Erwin said, "from the founding of our kingdom through to my great-grandfather's rule. The next volume is on the desk. That holds my grandfather's time through now." "We don't have any historical documents," Jocelyn said. "Tragically, they were burned when my sister was small. My father said it was an accident, but I'm not so sure now." "You think your sister did it intentionally," Erwin said. Though it wasn't formed as a question, Jocelyn answered. "I do." "And you still allowed her to take the throne when your father died?" Jocelyn looked at him. What he'd asked wasn't said with malice, but it was harsh. "She is the eldest," she said. "It was her place to take, not mine." "Even if she wasn't fit to rule?" "That is irrelevant," she insisted. "Is it?" he asked. His tone wasn't one of condemnation, but it did hold concern. "The kingdom is only as good as its leader," he continued. "Your sister, while gathering more land for the kingdom, is not a good leader. She is manipulative, selfish, and demanding in ways that are a detriment." "But it is where she belongs," Jocelyn insisted. "Not if you would make a better ruler," he replied. "She wants the power, but doesn't think of what's best for the country. You would put the country above yourself, no matter the cost." "Which is why she is ruling," she said. "No," Erwin replied. "She's ruling because she said she should, and you did nothing to stop her." "How could I?" "Simple," he said. "Take the throne away from her. You would have your country behind you, and it would be a simple transfer of power." "You really don't know my sister," she said. "She will never give up the throne." Erwin knew they could go round and round with this conversation and end up exactly where they were now. "Will you support your father's bid to regain his kingdom?" "Of course," she said. "Which means you want what is best for your country," he replied, proving my point. that you are a more fit ruler. It's irrelevant, she said. Father is alive. He will return to the throne, and Cecily will be removed. I'm afraid it isn't that simple. The voice came from the doorway. Jocelyn turned, expecting to see the strong man her father was when he left. Instead, she saw a man who had been broken down by the magic her sister had forced upon him. He was older, hunched over from the hard work he'd been forced to do the last 10 years. And she saw that the spark that once was bright in his eyes had faded. Father, she said as she rushed to him. My sweet bean, he replied, calling her by a nickname he'd given her when she was tiny. Why didn't you tell me you were alive? She pleaded through tears. He couldn't, Erwin said. Jocelyn turned to him and demanded, You should have come to me. We didn't know who to trust, King Tanis said. Looking at her father, she asked, Why didn't you trust me? Let's sit, Erwin said, indicating the seats near the fire. It was burning well now, and the heat was welcome after the cold they'd endured. Why did you wait so long? Jocelyn asked when they'd gotten comfortable. The curse your sister placed on your father was extremely volatile, Erwin explained. It wasn't as simple as telling you he was alive because he wasn't. Not really. So you did die, she said. In a manner of speaking, yes, Tanis replied. My brothers and I were on the hunt with your father, Erwin continued. We were not near him when the magic was struck, but we saw and heard it. By the time we found him, it was too late to do much of anything. He was shriveling rapidly, shrinking before our eyes. If they hadn't had a healer with them, I would not have survived at all, Tanis said. They saved my life in that moment, but there was a long road ahead of me if I were to ever gain back any kind of strength. You brought him here, Jocelyn said, to help him recuperate. And I hoped to one day return him to his rightful place on the throne, Erwin agreed. Cecily has grown too strong, Tanis said. She has not only gained lands, but has taken the magic from them as well. If we had been able, Erwin continued, we would have unseated her immediately. Your father, however, was unable to stand against her. He would have failed, and she would have killed him outright. We couldn't let her know that he was alive, which meant we couldn't let you know, Tanis said. I'm so sorry, Bean. I would have come sooner, sent word even, but it was too dangerous. So instead you sent a spy, she said, someone to see whether Cecily was vulnerable. We had to assess her power, Erwin said. What do you get out of this? Jocelyn asked. A better ally than I currently have, Erwin replied. I also get to see the rightful king returned to his throne. Nothing more than a political alliance and power, she said. I would hope that it would extend to you, he said. Not just for political reasons. Am I to be a pawn in your business dealings? You could never be a pawn, Jocelyn, Erwin said. You are too powerful to be held down by someone else's rule. I'm surprised you withstood your sister's reign as long as it is. What is that supposed to mean? There was a plot to kill you as well, Tanis said. Jocelyn looked at her father, then back to Erwin, unsure whether she could believe what they said. Cecily would never harm me, she said. Think about it, Erwin said. She is in control of the kingdom, has gathered power by the year, and the only one who could take it away from her is you. I would never do that, she said. There is no reason for me to try to gain control of the kingdom. Which is why you have survived, Tanis said. Make no mistake, I love your sister. She is a perfect replica of your mother in nearly every way. You never talk about Mother, Jocelyn said. And we should, Tanis replied. But that is a conversation for a later day. Now, I think we could all use some rest. Tomorrow is going to be demanding, and I want to be prepared for all it will entail. What is happening tomorrow? Jocelyn asked. Tomorrow, Erwin said, we plan a war. For nearly a month, King Tanis, King Erwin, and Princess Jocelyn, along with Erwin's army, plotted to their overthrowing of Queen Cecily. It was not going to be easy, but they had something she didn't. They knew the war was coming. How have your letters been received? Tanis asked one morning in early spring. The replies are such that it appears she believes my lies, Jocelyn said. She is planning a ball in the next few weeks and asked that I return to help her. Will you? If we think it is the best course of action to take, then that is what I will do, she replied. I believe that you should return to the castle and help with the preparations, Erwin said. It will give you an inside look at what her defenses are. That will help us immensely. I'm not a spy, she retorted. You are also not a puppet, King Tanis said. Make sure an invitation is sent to me, Erwin said. Why would she invite you? Jocelyn asked. You've never been invited to any of the other balls. Tell her you met him when you were traveling, Tanis said. Let her think you've become smitten with him and that you simply want her opinion on him before you let the relationship go too far. I'll not lie to my sister, Jocelyn said. Does that mean you're not smitten with me? Erwin asked. Jocelyn looked at the man. True, they had spent many days together, talking well into the night about not only the upcoming war, but of how kingdoms should run. She was taken with him, and not just for his handsome looks. He was intelligent, kind, and had proven himself more than a friend to her family. She could do much worse in finding a partner for her life. What she wasn't sure about, though, was whether she wanted to leave her father alone in the castle, especially if her sister kept any of the powers she'd amassed. I see you thinking, he said. Are you trying to find a polite way to tell me I'm not worthy of your affections? I already know that. I'm worried about leaving my father alone in the castle, she said. You know we'll be stripping your sister of her powers, right? Her father asked. She's stronger than you could possibly know, she said. You have been away for a long time, Father. What she is capable of is much worse than you can imagine. I think I have an idea, he said, and she realized that he knew firsthand of her strengths. We have a good plan, Erwin said. I think your returning to the Northlands is the best way to keep us knowledgeable of Cecily's movements. If you're gone too long, she may become suspicious. You really think she'll believe that I've fallen for you, she asked. I believe you can convince her that the sky is green and the grass is blue, he said. Then I shall leave tomorrow, she said. It will take nearly a week to get home, and during that time I can come up with exactly the right words to give her. It's settled then, King Tanis said. We shall plan to attend the ball and bring the best gift the kingdom has seen. Its rightful heir on their throne once more, Erwin said. I've missed you so, Cecily said as Jocelyn arrived a week later. There's so much to tell you, Jocelyn replied as she stepped from the coach. I've met someone, she said. Do tell, Cecily said, guiding her into the castle. It was the most ridiculous thing, Jocelyn continued once they'd made their way into the library. What is he like? Jocelyn told the tale they had created that they were planning when they were planning her return. She explained that the guard had convinced her to go away with him. Once they were far enough from the kingdom, he'd changed, turned into an ogre, bent on kidnapping her and ransoming her for control of the throne. When the king of Bonzir had come along, he'd slayed the ogre, setting the princess free. He took care of her, kept her safe, and allowed her to recover at her own pace within his castle. Cecily, of course, was enraptured with the tale, completely taken in by this man's kindness. She insisted on inviting him to the ball, and the plan the three had created was in place. Jocelyn knew that her sister would try to take the king away from her, But she also knew there would be more than one king coming to the ball. Ione must create a spectacular gown, Cecily said. What is the king's favorite color? I honestly don't know, Jocelyn confessed. We never discussed anything of that nature. Well, surely you saw what color he used in the castle, the elder sister said. That would give you an indication, a good indication of what he prefers. There wasn't much color, truthfully, she replied. It was definitely lacking in a woman's touch. Perhaps that is something we could offer him. I have something much more valuable to offer, the queen replied. Jocelyn knew what her sister had in mind and was nearly sickened by it. There was no way she would allow her sister to steal Erwin from her. It surprised her that she felt this way, like he was a possession she needed to guard. Had she really fallen for him during their time together? We should have Ione create matching gowns, the queen said. I wouldn't want to take any attention from you, Jocelyn replied. You should have the best gown. I can simply wear something I've worn before. If you insist, Cecily said. Her sister saw through the act and knew this was exactly what she was expected to do, bow down to her sister's power. After the evening meal, Jocelyn retired to her room, feigning a headache and exhaustion from her travels. Cecily, of course, let her go. The next few weeks were imperative for their plan to work. Jocelyn hoped she could play the part without suspicion until the time of the ball arrived. She would be glad when the charade was over. You look beautiful, Jocelyn said to her sister the evening of the ball. Don't I, though, the queen returned. You are as pretty as ever. It was a term Cecily used to put her sister down. Jocelyn never minded, but tonight she knew she looked stunning. She wore the same gown she'd worn when Erwin had escorted her to the ball, and she hoped he liked it as much tonight as he had then. When are we expecting the King of Bonseer? The queen asked. I believe he will be arriving a little late, the princess responded. Apparently there was a mishap on the way and they've had a delay. Then his entrance will be that much more spectacular, the queen said. Jocelyn held her tongue, knowing that the delay was needed to ensure that they were both in the ballroom when her father and King Erwin arrived. It wouldn't do to have the queen be unseated if she wasn't in the room. They made their way to the ballroom, Jocelyn entering first so the queen could be announced with royal fanfare. It hadn't bothered the princess before, but now she saw it as grandstanding and knew that her sister simply did it to make a show. Finding her seat on the dais, she slipped the tonic she'd been given into the queen's goblet. No one saw her do it as they were all looking to the royal entrance. Filling the cup with wine, she handed it to her sister with a smile. While not toxic, the liquid was to control her powers, make her mortal, at least for the time being. Once her father arrived, he would bind her powers with his own. It was a surprise to learn that her father had magic within him. She'd always assumed he was mortal and that all the powers she and her sister held within them were from their mother. Tonight would be a defining moment in their land, one that would be talked about for years and years to come. She hoped it would be a pleasant retelling. The royal guard announced that the King of Bonseer had arrived and would soon be coming to the ballroom. Cecily primped herself up, taking in the last of the wine in her goblet, then turned to her sister. Do I look all right? She asked. You look splendid, Jocelyn said. It was true. Her sister was a beautiful woman. Too bad that beauty didn't penetrate the surface to the soul of the woman. The herald called out the king's arrival, and in walked Erwin, King Tanis at his right. Their true appearances had been shrouded in glamour, but Jocelyn knew it was them because she was immune to the glamour. Her sister, however, was taken in by Erwin's appearance. They'd been meticulous in designing his appearance so that it would be the most pleasing to her. He walked to the dais and bowed low. Your Majesty, he said, it is an honor to be invited to your gala. Cecily was completely under his spell. "It is a shame I haven't invited you before now," she said. "How I've missed the opportunity to spend time with such an honorable noble. Your kindness to my sister is deeply appreciated." "It was no trouble at all," he said, bowing slightly to the princess. "She was in danger, and I wouldn't have that. I'm just happy I was able to protect her." "Please," Cecily said, "won't you join us on the dais?" Again, Erwin bowed low. Then he and King Tanis climbed the steps and settled themselves next to the queen. "We feast tonight in honor of our guests," the queen said. "They saved our beloved princess, my dear sister, from a fate that none would desire." The rest of the guests gave out a rousing cheer, and the meal continued. As the evening progressed, Jocelyn began to feel a darkness within the room. Something she'd felt at the last ball. She dismissed it the last time after her conversation with King Erwin, but it was back, and definitely not coming from him. He caught her eye, and she could see that he felt it too. Without warning, a dark cloud rose from the center of the room. Suddenly, the guard were around the dais, and Erwin was next to her, shielding her from whatever may arise. "Show yourself!" the queen shouted. The fog gathered in the center of the room, and from the middle of it rose a being. Concealed in a cloak, the figure turned toward the dais. Eyes shone from under the hood, and a voice that was deep and not quite real came from it. "You are not the true ruler," it said. "You are an imposter. You do not belong." It raised its arm, though they couldn't see any structure, simply more black fog oozing from the ends of the cloak. "The king is here," it continued. "He sits amongst us. He was never gone." Jocelyn looked to her father, cloaked as he was in the glamour, and saw him smile. "Beg for mercy, woman," the being said, "though you do not deserve it." "What are you going on about?" Cecily shouted. She raised her hand to drive the being away, but it simply laughed. "You are powerless," it said, "stripped by those who know the truth." Jocelyn saw true fear in her sister's eyes then. Never had she seen anything like what was manifesting in the middle of the room. The power it emitted could be felt, pushing against her body as it drifted closer. "Why did you steal the throne?" it asked. "Because you sought the power you thought it held." The answer didn't make sense to Jocelyn, but she didn't have time to think too long on it. The being was now atop the dais, floating along the table, though not truly there. "The king of the Northlands is alive and well," it said. "He's dead!" Cecily screamed. "I killed him!" "You are not that powerful," the being laughed. "Always the petulant child, wanting what you couldn't have, thinking you were greater than what you truly were. I thought you would have learned from your mistakes, but I was wrong. Divinity, stop!" Cecily looked to the man on the dais, confused. "Tanis," the being said, "you should have controlled her better." "Perhaps if you'd stuck around," he said. "She was more yours than mine." "Who are you?" Cecily cried. Allowing the glamour to fall away, King Tanis stood tall and proud. "Hello, daughter." "Father?" Cecily whispered, "but you're dead." "Not nearly as much as you'd hoped," he replied. Erwin watched as the king moved toward his eldest daughter, allowing the glamour to fall from himself at the same time. "What did you hope to gain by killing me?" the king asked. "I wouldn't," Cecily stammered. "Silence," the being said. "Sit." As if forced, Cecily sat in a chair, but not on the throne. "Listen, child," the apparition said. Suddenly the smoke and fog faded, and a tall, pale, beautiful woman stood where it was. "Mother?" Cecily asked. "You've been naughty," she replied. "But," the elder sister replied. "You should have come back sooner," Tanis said. "I've missed you." The goddess made her way to the throne, embracing her husband. "And I've missed you," she said. "Whatever are we to do with our child?" he asked. Divinity looked at her daughter and sighed. "She'll need to learn to be a better person," she said. "And we accomplish this how?" the king asked. "By making her know what it's like to be powerless," the goddess said. "I've done that," the king replied. "And removing the temptation from her grasp," the mother said. "She will learn to think of others before herself. It's a lesson she should have been taught much sooner." "We have not done our duty," the king said. "For that, we have caused our subjects to pay." "Then she will become one of them," Divinity said. Jocelyn watched as her sister began to shake, both in fear and as a result of the magic that was being thrust upon her by their mother. "Stop," she said. Both the king and goddess looked at their younger daughter. "She won't survive," Jocelyn said. "It would kill her to become a peasant." "What do you propose, daughter?" the mother asked. "Simply strip her of her power," she said. "That is punishment enough." "You are kinder than I would have expected," Divinity said. "How is it that you don't hate your sister?" "While she's not perfect," Jocelyn began, "she is still family. You love your family no matter what. Whether I liked it or not, she kept me safe this last decade. She could have killed me or banished me, but she didn't. She kept me close and safe. For that, she deserves some credit." Tanis looked at his younger daughter and smiled. "You are truly fit to rule this land," he said. "Not until it's my time," she replied. "Or until you find another land to rule," the mother said. Jocelyn turned and looked at Erwin and smiled. Yes. She might just find another land that was better suited for her to rule. One where she could partner with someone who was as strong as her parents and worthy of her affections. Cecily stared as the others talked until she finally tried to escape. "You are going nowhere," Divinity said. "I neglected my duties as a mother to you. That is on me. From now on, you will do as you are told. You will learn kindness, compassion, and respect." "But we will teach you in love," Tanis said as he took his wife's hand. Late summer saw the wedding of King Erwin of Bonesair and Princess Jocelyn of the Northlands. It was attended by nearly everyone in the region. When they welcomed their first child, a son, he was named after Erwin's father, Calin. Their second child, a daughter, they named Emily, was born 2 short years later. They grew to be kind, caring, and compassionate people, just like their parents. Cecily never regained any of her powers, choosing a life of solitude in the castle without setting foot out of her room for the remainder of her life. Many speculated that she was kept as a prisoner, but Jocelyn knew it was her sister's own choosing. King Tanis ruled the land with his wife, the goddess, as his side. When his time in this world was coming to an end, he decreed that the land should be ruled by Bonesair. Young Calin began ruling the land at the age of 21 and continued to rule the way his parents and grandparents did, with kindness, compassion, and with the people of his land's best interest in mind. Generation after generation followed in their footsteps. Some tried to take control of the lands, but the lessons learned by the once Queen Cecily were stories that were handed down as a warning. None wanted a repeat of that time. So that's my story. It's kind of fun. The very first scene that I saw when I read this prompt, the night's bleak and biting and cold in winter, and I think it was very cold when we got this prompt too, I think it was snowy and everything, was just this desolate landscape this frozen landscape. And that's where that first scene of Tristan and Erwin standing on the wall came from, was just a desolate landscape of snow and ice and cold. And I knew Erwin was going to be the hero in the story, just like I knew Jocelyn was going to be the heroine. I just knew. And so it just kind of developed. I had to change a couple of things in the beginning once I got later on, because originally I had Erwin be from the Northlands, and then I decided no, he needs to be coming in to save the Northlands and return the king. So I had to change that he had come in. So, which it was fun to find all the little bits and pieces. But yeah, it was, that first scene was very distinctly in my mind's eye when I read the prompt. I mean, it was clear. Two soldiers standing on guard on the castle wall, looking out over a desolate frozen landscape, was just clear. So, and I love writing prompts, because sometimes they'll just give you this vision, this clear, obvious way for the story to go. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes you look at them and you're like, this is dumb. But most of the time, something in the prompt clicks inside of you, and it just catapults the story along. So it was very fun. So that's my story. That's Trinity January, my story Royals. My name is Carrie Avery Moriarty. Thanks for listening.